Hunger strike was the last resort open to prisoners. They'd been the blanket since 1976. That had escalated into the dirty protest, and still the prison regime wouldn't yield. Describe to me the brutality that existed in the H blocks during that period.
Well, the brutality was systematic and was carried out on a daily basis. And it's interesting that most of the times when you were beaten by screws, they had to have some sort of spurious excuse to do it. For example, you were told to squat over a mirror so that they could search your back passage. We resisted that type of humiliation and degradation, and it resulted in physical beatings from the prison staff. Other occasions, they would come into cells, to search cells. They would beat people. When we were being moved from wing to wing, and the wing shifts as they were called, again they used the excuse of the mirror search to beat people. But it happened constantly. Sometimes it was worse than others, but it happened systematically, and it happened on an ongoing daily basis.
The conditions were deteriorating. We were in cells with our own excrement smeared around the walls. We hadn't washed. You know, imagine if you didn't get a shower for 2 or 3 days, how you would feel. If you couldn't brush your teeth for a week, how would you feel? And this went on for year after year after year.
The first hunger strike of late 1980 ended without any deaths, but the British government reneged on their commitments. How did that affect your approach to the second hunger strike?
I actually joined the first hunger strike in the last week. I think there were 28 of us joined in the last week of that hunger strike before it ended. But when it was announced that there was going to be a second hunger strike, and Bobby sent round all the blocks asking for volunteers, my approach or my attitude was no different than it had been the first time. However, I would say, if anything, we were more determined and more resolved than we had ever been, that we weren't going to be defeated and the struggle wasn't going to be broken as a result of the collapse of a second hunger strike.
It came to a stage when we were forced into a situation where we didn't have any alternative. The protest had to be brought to a head. We saw ourselves as part of the struggle, part of the overall struggle. We wanted to continue participating in that struggle. We hadn't really picked the ground for the battle. That had been set by our enemies. But we were still prepared, as far as we were concerned, to be frontline soldiers. So we decided that we would embark on hunger strike.
And in 1981, on a personal level, were you for or against hunger strike?
Well, even before 1981, going back as far as 1979, when a decision was taken towards the end of '79 that hunger strike action was going to be pursued, I was one of the people who favoured it and continued to favour it through 1980. And even coming out of the end of the 1980 hunger strike, I was also in favour of pursuing hunger strike action during 1981.
Just how important was it for the prisoners to defeat the criminalisation policy? And what would the ramifications have been if Britain had succeeded?
Well, you need to go back to the mid-70s when the British actually introduced this. And even before this policy kicked in, you had the introduction of the non-jury single-judge diplock court system, where you had the whole torture mill of Castlereagh, Golf Barracks, and then the individual judge through the court. So, I mean, the British had decided that the best way they felt to defeat the Republican struggle was to criminalise it. They thought they could do it by criminalising the prisoners and by breaking the prisoners. So the issue at stake wasn't an issue of internal sort of cosmetic reforms or an internal prison dispute whereby some form of small reforms may have secured it. It was sitting very, very high on a political platform, which was huge. And it was huge in terms of the ramifications that you mentioned, both to the IRA and the Republican struggle, and to the British. So whoever would come out on top of that, it would be a boost to whoever succeeded coming out the other end of that there. And certainly the issue at stake being the criminalisation of struggle. The first prisoner to resist that policy was Kieran Nugent and became the first blanket man. And in a sense, you know, he set the pace for struggle for everybody else within the prison, that the prisoners, and particularly the hunger strikers, were not going to allow themselves to be used as a weapon to either undermine, damage, or you know, create difficulties for the morale of our people and our struggle.
Was the average prisoner aware of the enormity of what was taking place, that if this criminalisation policy succeeded, then the struggle could effectively be broken?
I think, I mean, we did have discussions in the blocks about that, and most people were aware of the larger picture and the implications that it would have for the struggle if the hunger strike collapsed in failure. However, in many ways, the hunger strike was also a response to the conditions and the environment that we found ourselves in. So in many ways, it was a direct struggle. We saw it as a direct struggle between ourselves and the prison administration, rather than, you know, a bigger struggle between ourselves and the British. But, you know, ultimately, defeat or failure would have had the same consequences for us.
And here we have a book with persons from the outside commenting on what's going on the inside. What was the mood of the prisoners towards the outside world at that time?
Well, in a sense, I mean, we were cut off in 1981 from the outside world. You know, you'd no access to media, you'd no newspapers, no radios, no TV, one visit per month, and the communication network we had was with the Sinn Féin Centre outside in the Falls Road for information purposes, and obviously communication with the Army Council, but communication in a private sense with family and friends. So that's how we sort of got round acquiring the events of the day, plus smuggled in small radio sets, crystal sets that we were able to tune in to, for example, Radio Ulster, to get the news reports. So we were well up to date in terms of communication. We were also aware of the tremendous efforts that were being made by people on the outside from the very start, with the Relatives Action Committees in '76 right through the formation in October '79 of the H Block Armagh Committee, and the amount of work and the tremendous amount of effort that was put in both nationally and internationally.
We spent years trying to mobilise opinion. The prisoners on the inside, I mean, we sent them in regular reports. We built crystal set radios, which they were able to listen to the news and monitor the news. We reprinted Republican news in miniature form and smuggled them in. We tried to keep them up to date as much as possible. I mean, there was a leadership in the jail, an IRA leadership in the protest. There was people in charge of publicity, for example, Bobby Sands and Brendan McFarlane were two people who I dealt with during that period. So the prisoners knew the reality, knew that there was difficulties, which was obviously very demoralising for them, but still they maintained the protest for 5 years. And eventually, well, the hunger strike ended on the 3rd of October 1981, and within 2 weeks prisoners had their own clothes. The prisoners were then, through the strength of their numbers, were able to go into blocks and with loyalists and confront loyalists and establish segregation. So the jail was transformed, and the prison administration, as senior figures in the prison administration, were to admit to Chris Ryder, who published a book about the history of the Northern Ireland Prison Officers Association, admitted that they knew they were political prisoners, and stated that the only way eventually we knew we could run the jail was by giving them political status.